Good morning, I'm Wayworn Worm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome back to The Stolen Land, episode 15. Gold. The rains had let up by the next morning as the expedition left Oleg's trading post. Lucian noted that Keston Garrus's men's tents were sitting staked into what was now mud rather than the dirt it had been. Although, as they left through the gates, they did notice that some of the few trees that were nearby were in the process of being chopped down. Lucian took a moment to call up to the watchman about it, who told them that they were in the process of making a crude platform to stake their tents on what would be above the mud. Lucian accepted this information and turned back to his group and pulled his cloak tighter around himself. It might be a dry morning, but it was also a very cold morning. As they trudged away from the trading post, skirting the forest, they made it into the hills of the Kamelands near mid-morning. This proved to be even more of a challenge to map than the forest had been. There are many hills and crags and all sorts of natural obstacles, and unlike the forest, they couldn't just go around or blaze a trail. Near the end of their mapping for the day, they came across a particularly rocky crag that rose from one of the many hills in the area. Huh, look at that! Petra exclaimed, pointing at the base of the crag. Hidden in the undergrown area at the base of the crag was a crack that was large enough for a person to climb down into. She quickly set up a rope, tied around her waist, and handed the other end to Lucian. Hold on tight. I'm going down. After about a minute, she found herself slowly climbing down into a cave with almost no light. While hanging in mid-air, she lit a torch and yelled up for them to slowly lower her down. Once she was fully down, she found herself in a cave that was roughly 30 feet in every direction. She noticed that a part of one of the walls of the cave sparkled slightly in her torchlight. Walking toward the wall, she looked closely and gasped, tugging at the rope to be pulled back up. Once up, she looked around at the group. You won't believe what I found down there. Lucian looked at her, slightly bemused. He was not used to Petra being this animated or excited. He experienced her as a woman who was well in control of her emotions and was very precise at all moments. What did you find down there? He finally asked. Gold, was her one-word reply. There's an entire vein of it. I'm sure that given time and the right expertise, we could turn this into a functioning gold mine. Lucian nodded and looked to Umbria, who was already working on her map. I know, boss. Note this, but in a way that it doesn't announce to the world what it is. He smiled at her. And that is why you're our cartographer. Really? Is that why? I thought it had something to do with me being the best cartographer you have. Lucian laughed and shrugged. Well, that too. The rest of their day passed without anything else of note happening, until they were setting down for dinner that night. Howls filled the air that got progressively closer to the camp. It was also clear fairly early on that the howls were coming from a single creature, and that creature was coming to camp. Given the warning, the entire party was able to don armor and get weapons ready when they could finally hear something large begin to circle their camp just out of the firelight. Every now and again, they could see baleful eyes shine before the fight finally began. Finally, the creature jumped into the camp, fully clearing the tent that Tiber had set up for himself. It was a large, wolf-like creature, but it looked intelligent and, frankly, evil, and almost human. It was covered in chainmail and held a longsword in one hand. Tiber gasped as he saw it fully in the light. A werewolf! Petra pulled out her short swords and attacked the creature. Even though she was able to take it somewhat by surprise and strike it twice, both times the chainmail turned her blades aside. Tiber went next, slashing at it with his scimitar. He sliced through a few weaker rings of the chainmail and drew blood as his scimitar went deep into the beast. It howled loudly as it was cut. Lucian ran up, joining his companions around the creature, and he thrust with his sword. The creature was not prepared for his attack, and Lucian was able to mortally wound it as it fell to the ground, never to get up again. The werewolf attack certainly struck a chord deep inside everyone. They were not expecting to see something like that here. Even though the werewolf ended up being an easier foe than many of the creatures they had fought, it was on a different level. A werewolf somehow drove home to them that this area really was wild in a way that nothing they'd ever faced here before had. Werewolves were a supernatural threat that had curses and magic involved with them. Shambling mounds, will-o-wisps, thylacines, they were all more or less natural creatures. There was at least no malignancy with them. Everyone had a fitful sleep that night, and they each took watch on a higher vigil than they had been in months. And Tiber thought he saw something poke around near the camp on his watch in the depths of the night, but nothing seemed to come of it. That was the only other event in the night before they started off, tired, in a light drizzle the next morning. As they entered the next area they were going to map, they sighted in the distance something that just further drove home the lessons from the previous night. A single warg ran across the hilltop a few miles from them as they crested the hill they had been climbing. The Kamelands were apparently much more wild than at least the section of the Gnarl Marches nearest to civilization. Although it did make sense, that was the area where most of the hunters and trappers spent most of their time. The more intelligent creatures would avoid the areas where humans encroached if they could. The counterpoint to that line of reasoning, of course, was that the Staglord's hideout was still apparently farther into this wilderness than the sightings of these werewolves and wargs. That fact occurred to each member of the expedition, and it served to make the Staglord seem even more dangerous in their minds than he had before. A man who was willing to live, and to a minor extent rule, from an area filled with such creatures of evil was certainly not to be trifled with lightly. About halfway through their day, they came across a bridge that was very clearly rickety and missing a few of its boards that crossed the Thorn River. "Let's not take any chances. We'll cross one at a time," Lucian said before starting across himself. "Once I'm across, Petra will go next, followed by Umbria. Then our two horses, one at a time, and Tiber will bring up the rear." He was not going to take any chances after what had happened the last night. They were able to safely make it across and do the small amount of mapping they had planned to do on this side of the river. There should be another crossing where the Thorn and Shrike rivers meet tomorrow, and we'll cross then. The group agreed to what Lucian said. Not that they had much choice. He was the designated leader of the group. Either way, it was fine with them. None of them had much of a desire to cross that bridge again, and it had seemed ready to crash down, sending them into the river below, especially as they sent the horses across. Luckily, that night passed without note, except for the fact that the light drizzle not only didn't stop, but it picked up to a nice rain by the time they'd woken up. It was quite difficult for them to start a fire the next morning, so they ate their trail rations cold. Something that was even worse than the rations hot. About midway through the day, they found the crossing that Lucian had predicted, but it was not quite as they had expected. There's no bridge or anything here. The Thorn River simply widened out and became much shallower before joining the Shrike River. Though it was shallow, the water was still 3 feet deep and went most of the way to their chests. Not that they got any wetter given the rain. It was still an unpleasant experience. But they were back on the right side of the river for this leg of the mapping journey. Tomorrow, we'll visit the soot scales as we map near their caves, Lucian announced that night at dinner. Thank you so much for listening to episode 15 of The Stolen Land, Gold. Now, make sure you tune in tomorrow. I have a really awesome Friday show planned. Also, there's something that might happen tonight if this video is new. I am waiting to hear from the organizer of it, but keep an eye on my community posts. I will definitely post there if I know about it. Thank you so much.